Welcome to CSS Grid. It is my job to introduce our next speaker. I met this guy 3 or 4 years ago, but we met for the first time in person yesterday because in this crazy world that we live in, it's all online. And so I've done podcasts with this guy. I've asked him a bunch of CSS questions all the time because he's a wizard at CSS. And he is a designer at Milthy. Did I get that right?
Correct. Yep.
So he does front-end development and design, and he's really good at it. So please welcome Tim Smith.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk called Let's Learn CSS Grid. I'm Tim Smith, and I am part Guatemalan and part Puerto Rican. I am probably the only Latino you know whose name is Tim Smith. Long story, but you can ask me later. I used to write a site called The Bold Report. It's now called Brightly Colored. It was renamed because I wear bright colors. I work for a company called Milthy, and Milthy's purpose is to try to make cooking a little bit healthier, a little bit easier, and I'm a designer and front-end developer there. So what are we going to be talking about today? First off, the problems that we've had with layout. What is CSS Grid? And does it solve those problems that we've had? Why do you need to learn this? That's a very valid question. So we'll try to answer that as well. And then lastly, some resources. This is only a 45, 50-minute talk. So there's only so much we can do in an hour's time. All right, so let's talk about our problems with layout. I'm only going to be talking about 10 years back because that's how much I've worked in this industry. I've built one table layout in my life. So for those of you who have built many table layouts, my heart goes out to you. So let's talk about floats first. So floats are still something that we're kind of still using. If you're using Foundation, maybe Bootstrap, these frameworks still use floats as part of their framework, especially some of the older versions of it. They've been updated to use Flexbox, but I mean, for the most part, there are a lot of us that are still using floats for layout. But no one needs to tell us this, right? It's a hack. Floats are a hack. They're not made for layout, and because of that, we've had to do hacks upon hacks. ClearFix is one of those hacks because float was not made for layout. And, you know, that makes our lives difficult. And it's led to a lot of frameworks like Foundation, like Bootstrap, like the 10,000 others that I don't want to specifically name, but it's, you know, it's led to a lot of CSS frameworks. We're writing a lot less CSS, you and I, these days because of it. And it's led to markup like this. You know, small 12, medium 6, large 8. I mean, we're describing our layouts in our markup, and we all know that that's not something good to do. But floats have their utility. Like if you're trying to float text around an image or a piece of content, floats really do help. They have a purpose, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But here is the important part. They're not made for the layouts that we're having to make these days. We have so many different screen sizes that it's impossible to do these with floats, really, I think, especially if we want to get creative with our layouts. If we want to get away from sidebar main content, and then when, you know, everything shrinks down to mobile, we just have it in one column. If we want to get away from that, we need something more complex, a tool that is made for complex layout. Another few of the reasons is math. Floats forces us to have to do math. We need to know the exact width of a column. Adding more columns requires math because now we have to calculate the space that new column is going to take up, the margin that column is going to need from the other columns. You could use padding, but then if you have columns that have backgrounds, that doesn't really work. You need margin, right? It's also led to some complex nth-child selectors to remove margin from columns that don't need it. And this is just really complex, and it makes our lives difficult. Doing something just as simple as this with floats is very, very difficult to do, and it shouldn't be. So let's talk about another tool that we've had, which is Flexbox. And the nice thing about Flexbox is how flexible it is, and it's part of the name, right? So Flexbox understands the amount of space that it has, can adjust to that. And this is good and bad, because you can have a sidebar and a main column that will expand and shrink based on the available space, which is nice. Something that, simple like this, and a side and a main. Then you put some CSS on it. Display flex, you make it, you give it flex values for the aside and the main, and then you have something that kind of looks like this. These two columns are completely flexible and understand the space that they reside in. But what if we were to do a card layout? So many of you have seen this. I'm using an unordered list, and then I'm having 5 list items inside of there. With CSS, we'll add display flex. We're wrapping them. We're giving them a little bit of a background, some margin, and then a flex value. And then you come up with this. But this is not what I want, right? I want 5 columns. I want 5 cards that all have the same exact width. But doing this with Flexbox isn't all that easy, because you have to use hard-coded values and max widths, because Flexbox sees the empty space and is like, oh, wait, let me fill that up, and that's not ideal. Also, you'll see a pattern here. I hate math, and Flexbox makes me do more math. It's the same thing as if I were doing columns with floats. I still have to do math to calculate how the columns work and their different sizes. Also, again, we come back to this. You need stupid nth-child selectors like this. And I don't know about you, but I've referenced that like nth-child page on CSS Tricks thousands of times, because I can never remember which crappy one to use. But wait a second. Then we need ones for bigger screens. So now, since we've gone from a 2-up layout to a 3-up layout, now we have to change it. And then this is cluttering our CSS files. And it's just not good, But don't get me wrong, Flexbox is amazing. And I've really enjoyed working with Flexbox. And Flexbox has made my job a lot easier. And I'm sure you might feel like that. It's switched us from this mentality of having like individual items to a container, and then you applying things to that container that will then affect its children, which is good, because that's kind of the next iteration of things. Also, properties like align items or justify content have given us greater control over how things are aligned. And I mean, huge shout out to vertical align, right? Like, this was so difficult to do before, and now we have that. But here's the kicker, that we've also been using Flexbox wrong. We've kind of hacked it together to do complex layouts, and it really wasn't built for that. So that's why we have CSS Grid. And CSS Grid is going to help us a lot to create layouts in a simple way, in a lot easier way, and yet we're still going to retain a lot of power and control. But before we get into that, let's first talk about what CSS Grid is not. It is not here to kill floats. Floats are not going away. They're not going to suddenly not be part of the CSS spec. Like I said before, floats have their purpose. It's just we've not been using them for that. Again, CSS Grid is also not a Flexbox killer. Flexbox has its place, and CSS Grid is not here to replace it. But we're going to actually see how these three things can actually come together and form something really cool. Another one is that you don't need a framework, and I get a lot of pushback on this one, but you don't. The reason why we use frameworks a lot of the times for our layouts is because layout is tough. But that will no longer be the case with CSS Grid, because CSS Grid is the framework. And that's what we're going to find out today. So now let's talk a little bit about what it is. One of my favorite features is that CSS Grid is friendly. I wrote an article about CSS Grid, and I kind of assimilated it to peanut butter and jelly. Peanut butter and jelly are two great things on their own, but when you bring them together, they form a magic combination. And that is how CSS Grid is. You can combine it with other things to create something really awesome. Your whole page doesn't have to be in CSS Grid. It's not like you have to throw, again, away all the other tools you've been using, but it can be really useful in specific situations. So let's talk about a great use for Flexbox. So this is kind of a common pattern that we see in our navigations, right? In our headers. We've got a logo represented by a square black box. We've got a navigation and a search. This is an amazing use of Flexbox still, because our main purpose for this is for things to be in line. We're doing one-dimensional layout here. New items can be added to this navigation, and with Flexbox you can easily move stuff around so that it accommodates the new items. And Flexbox is really good at having things that are all in one row. What about floats? This is an excellent use of floats. We've got a biography, my biography, and then we've got an image represented here by a black box. This is still a great use of floats. We want that text to wrap around the image, and floats was made for that. So, what is CSS Grid good for? Well, I like what Jen Simmons says about it. Basically, she's talking about the fact that if you're having to put widths on things, whether they be flexible or fixed, you might want to be using Grid. And I think I would add to this and say that if you're wanting to do more than just one-dimensional layout, if you need things that are all in one row, and that's kind of how they're going to stay, no matter where it is, no matter where it is in the screen, then maybe Flexbox is for you. However, if you're having to do two-dimensional layout, you're having to do things that are here, then here, then here, like, that might be better for CSS Grid. So let's get into some of the basics of Grid and how you can use it. Number one, this is the door to Narnia, basically. Display Grid. So a Grid container works a lot like a Flexbox container. You specify a lot of properties to the container that then affect its children. And it's also a block level element. You have inline grid as well if you need inline grid, but grid is a block level element. The other one is grid template columns. And this new property accepts all the length units we know and love, like rem, m, pixels, view height, view width, percentages, and a few new ones, as we'll see too. And here's one of the new ones, the FR. The FR unit stands for fraction. And what this does is that it takes a fraction of the grid container. And I'll show you the power of this one in a bit. One of my favorites is grid gap. And grid gap is the shorthand for grid column gap and grid row gap. So you can have different gaps between rows and columns. And this is going to replace all of those nth child selectors that we've done for margin and stuff like that. So when you see this in action, I think you might be surprised. All right, so let's see it in action. We'll do what is so-called the Holy Grail layout. We've got the header, sidebar, main content, and footer. And this is a pretty common layout, right? So how would we do this with CSS Grid? So first of all, we have our markup. We've got a header and a side, a main, and a footer. Pretty easy stuff there. Then on the body, what we would do is we'd say display grid, and then say grid template columns to FR 3 FR, and grid gap of 2 rem. So just to explain really quickly what grid template columns does, here we're saying we want 2 columns. The first column is going to be 2 fractions of 5 columns, right? Because we're dividing up the page in 5 equal columns here. 2 FR, then 3 FR. So 3 out of 5, and then 2 out of 5 is going to be for our sidebar. The grid gap between rows and columns is going to be 2 rem. Now we're going to place our items. So we'll say with the header, we want it to start in grid column 1, and it's going to span 2 columns, which is the amount of columns that we have in our layout. For our aside, we'll say grid column end, span 1. That means it's only going to span 1 column. It's going to be in grid row number 2. For our main, we'll say grid column 2, span 1, because it's only going to span 1 column, starting from the 2nd column. And we'll say that it's part of grid row 2, sorry. And then our footer, grid column, starts at 1, span 2, same as the header, but then this one is going to be in grid row number 3. And what that looks like is like this. So this is a good time to probably explain grid lines. So with grid lines is an easy way to place our items, and that's kind of what we did in this previous slide. So what I like to think about is we have one more than as many grid columns or grid rows that we specified. So here we have 2 columns, but we have 3 grid lines, starting at the beginning of sidebar, at the beginning of main content, and then 1 at the end. In terms of rows, we have 1 that starts at the header, then at the main content level, then again at the footer, and then 1 at the end of the footer. And these grid lines allow you to place items wherever you'd like, basically. Now, let's rewrite that same layout, but with grid areas. So with grid areas, what we're going to say is the same type of thing: display grid, grid template columns, 2 FR, 3 FR, then our grid gap of 2 rem, which is what we had before. Oh, this is falling. And then our grid template areas, what we're going to say is header, header, aside, main, footer, and footer. And what that does is it's basically placing our items on the grid that we've already specified. Then header, aside, main, and footer get their corresponding grid areas. So wherever the grid area is, that's where those elements are going to be. And here we've specified that the header is going to be 2 columns on the first row. The aside is going to be the first column in the second row. The main is going to be the second column in the second row. And the footer is going to be in the third row, spanning 2 columns. And again, what that looks like is this. Now let's have a lot of fun with it. What if we were to do something like this? We were to put a period instead of a word there, then the header, and a period and the footer. What would that do? So that would move both of these to only fit one of the columns, and would leave our other column empty on those sides. Now, take a minute and think about, again, how something like this would be a lot more work to do, right? You would have to have your sidebar in a different wrapper. You'd have to have this main area in a different wrapper. Then you'd have to get them side to side. And now, when it comes time to do this responsively, how do you get the sidebar where you want it in this layout? It becomes more difficult. But this is actually really cool. It allows us to specify layouts easily. Modifying our layout for smaller screens suddenly gets a lot easier too. And the nice thing is that by default, grid only gives us 1 column. So we're going to rewrite our CSS with this in mind. So this is what we're going to do. We're saying display grid, grid gap of 2 rem again. But what we're going to say is header, main, and aside all in one line, which means that we're going to put all of these things in one column. And you notice that we have our areas exactly where we want them. We have a header first, we have our main second, then our aside, then our footer. Then we write a simple media query where we create the 2 columns that we want, because again, grid gives us by default only 1 column. And then we write our grid template areas to fit that new arrangement. And then this is what we get. A layout that is just easily responsive. It's amazing. The next one is a card layout. So again, we've kind of all seen this. We've maybe done this for our different projects or jobs. We want 3 cards up. We have 6 cards in total. And then we kind of want to go down to 2, then 1. So let's set this up with our markup. We'll create an unordered list called boxes. And we'll have 6 list items inside of there. Then we'll put them on the grid. And we'll say display grid, grid template columns, repeat autofill min max 300 pixels 1 FR, grid gap 1 rem. Yeah, I kind of went through that on purpose. All right, so let's dissect this line right here, because this is where all the work is being done here. So the first keyword that you see is repeat. And the repeat function allows us to tell the browser to repeat on the values we're about to give it. And it receives 2 arguments. It receives an argument of how many you want it to repeat and what the size of each of those things is to repeat. So that's why we're using then the autofill argument for how many, because we want the browser to make that decision. Autofill tells it to determine how many of what we're about to give it fit within that grid container. So the browser is doing all the math here. Yay. Then we have min-max, which then gives our autofill a little bit more context, because with min-max, it accepts, again, 2 arguments, the minimum and the maximum. So here we're saying that we want a minimum of 300 pixels for each card and a maximum of 1 FR, which is 1 fraction. So it's going to divide up the fractions evenly. And this is what we get. We got 2, so my browser window is kind of small. So we only have 2 here, but then as we go down, it goes down to 1. If you were to stretch it out, it would go out to 3, then 4, then 5, then 6. I mean, this is fully responsive in 3 lines of code. That's pretty awesome. And the thing is that we don't need any media queries. We didn't need any media queries for this. And it's fully responsive, again, with 3 lines of code. And really, again, the magic or the power is really in that 1 line. All right, let's try a different layout. So this is a layout that I did for my portfolio, because I wanted to do something a little bit more interesting than I'd been doing before. A layout like this is, I'm going to say impossible with floats, very difficult with Flexbox, but quite simple with CSS Grid. So again, let's set it up. With our unordered list, we'll say we want 5 different items in there. Then we'll set up our grid container. And we'll say display grid. Here's another new property that I'm going to explain in a minute. Grid auto rows. A grid gap of 2 pixels between each column and row. And then for our grid template columns, what I want is for it to repeat 6 times at 1 fraction. So it's going to divide up the grid container space into 6 equal fractions. And let's talk about Grid Auto Rows before we move on really quick. So by default, Grid creates new rows to place content in, so you don't have to create new rows for it. And by default, again, these rows are whatever size the content is within them. But Grid Auto Rows allows us to specify the size that these rows are. So with min-max, what we said here is that we want our rows to be a minimum of 100 pixels and then a maximum of auto. So whatever size the content is within it. So now we're going to place our items and child selectors. But anyway, so we're placing that first one, grid column 1, and then we're saying -1. 1 and -1 means that it's going to span all of the columns. -1 is like the last line. It's a substitute for whatever number the last line is. The second item, we're going to put it on grid column 1, and it's going to span 2 columns. And it'll span 3 rows. Our third item is going to start at grid column 3, and span 4 columns. And it's going to span 2 rows. And our last 2 items will span 2 columns. And what that CSS gives us is this layout. And again, I'm like so shocked by this stuff because these types of layouts were not possible before with such ease. And I mean, when I was creating the demos for this talk, it takes me less than 5 minutes to lay some of this stuff out. And while these layouts are simple, I think the concepts that they get across is that they can be very complex. This is the power of CSS Grid. It allows us to do very complex things quite easily, and I think that's awesome. Now, the question on everybody's mind, I would assume, is what is the support, right? Can I get a quick raise of your hands? How many people were thinking, I wonder what browsers support this? Okay, yeah. All right. I still got it. All right. So, so here's the support. So Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, iOS Safari, Android browser, and Chrome for Android all support CSS Grid with flying colors. Opera Mini does not support CSS Grid. But who uses Opera Mini? I'm kidding. I don't mean to offend anybody. And then the last one is Edge, right? Like, that's a big one. Edge doesn't support it right now. They support a legacy version of the CSS Grid spec. So you could actually make CSS Grid work in Edge 15. You would just have to know the right browser prefixes. The good thing is that little box under 15, which is 16. Which is going to fully support CSS Grid, which is awesome. I will say, though, that I don't see this box changing over here. And I don't see that as a huge problem, considering that most Windows users are moving over to Edge anyway, because all of Microsoft's new stuff uses Edge. But again, you'll have to do your own research, depending on what browsers you or your company supports. So why now? So if support is not 100%, why are we learning about this now, right? Because the support, according to this graph globally, is 75.15%. So that means that 30% of global users will not be able to see this. But again, I think the analytics for your specific sites or apps are going to be different. So, but still, the question remains, why now? And I think, first of all, it's our job. We want to be doing the best work for our clients and employees, and that means that we stay up to date with all the new stuff that comes out. Listening to this talk and playing around with it at home, doesn't mean that you have to use it in production. But I think it's a good idea to learn it. This is a big one for me. We are drastically simplifying our code bases by writing less lines of CSS here. And that's important. Also, the layouts that we talked about today, some of them are not very complex. I think the portfolio one is a bit more complex than the ones that we've been looking at. But you can do some pretty cool stuff with CSS Grid that is just not possible to do responsibly with anything else. And a big one for me is that I was like on the fence for Flexbox for a long time. And I was like, I don't need to learn it. Not many browsers use it anyway or support it. And yet, I'm using Flexbox in 100% of the work that I do today. And but I was late on that train, and I regret that. So then how do we support browsers that don't support CSS Grid? The methodology that I like to advocate for is feature queries. And if you don't know what feature queries are, they kind of look like this. You have @supports display grid, which means that if this browser supports display grid, here's the CSS for that. And then you can do @supports not display grid. So if a browser doesn't support CSS Grid, you can put some fallback CSS in there. And the support for feature queries is pretty good. Except over here again. Jerks. No, I'm kidding. They do a lot of great work. What do we do about IE11? Well, we can remember a little bit of how CSS works. Remember that browsers just ignore CSS that they don't understand. CSS that the browser does not support doesn't break anything else that's going on. Remember to use the cascade to your advantage. That might mean that you write display grid styles first, and then you have your fallback CSS second. Is that going to create more code now? Yes, it will. But there will come a time where you can open up your files and just delete all of that stuff anyway. And I definitely think that's within a year. Yeah. So, let's do a little summary of all this. Number one, CSS Grid is awesome. It drastically simplifies the code to create layouts, and we can create new layouts that were close to impossible before quite easily and responsively with CSS Grid. And responsibly, not just responsively. So, floats, Flexbox, multi-column, etc. These are all still layout systems that have their place. And that's so nice because CSS Grid is good friends with all those other things. The power that we have combined with CSS Grid, with floats, multi-column, Flexbox, this increases our toolbox and it makes us be able to do a lot of cool things. I think the last one is also to use it today. It doesn't mean that you have to push it to production, although I definitely am. But Firefox, Chrome, you saw all the different browsers that support it. The spec is solid. It's not going anywhere. CSS Grid is not going to disappear. And you can use fallbacks, like @supports or feature queries to do fallback CSS. If at the very least you play around with it on a project, on a personal project, or maybe on a code pen, I definitely recommend that. But this is only a 30, 40-minute talk, so this is only the beginning. So I want to give you some resources that you can check out. If you're taking notes, this will be the time to write these down. The first one is Rachel Andrew. Rachel Andrew has been talking about CSS Grid since 2014. She is the most experienced person that talks about CSS Grid. So if you want to learn the best of the best, go to her. She has this site called Grid by Example, which has a lot of tutorials on it. Some of them are video, which I've found very useful. So yeah, I definitely recommend Rachel Andrew. She actually just wrote a book as well on CSS layout, which includes CSS Grid for a book apart. The next one is Jen Simmons. Jen Simmons has a site that is part of her personal site called labs.jensimmons.com. And she does a lot of experiments with CSS Grid and Flexbox on this site, and they're just awesome. It's kind of like early days of the web, where you can inspect the sites and learn a lot. And lastly, the Mozilla Developer Network. This has been an invaluable resource for me. I've referred to it a lot. Rachel Andrew has actually written a lot of the guides that are for CSS Grid for the Mozilla Developer Network, so I definitely recommend that one. I know it's not very popular to say this, but read the spec if you can, because the spec has all the information. So the spec isn't light reading, that's for sure, but it's very educational. Questions? Sir in the back, yes?
Are you finding that your clients or your bosses or whatever you have there are willing to settle for the browsers that don't support CSS Grid to use a simpler layout that doesn't quite match the design for those browsers that don't support CSS Grid?
Yeah, so that's actually what I've been advocating for with clients that we know for sure we're going to support a browser that doesn't support CSS Grid right now, which is only IE11 basically. That's what we do. We create a simpler layout that can be coded up in a few seconds. That will still look good, present the information, but is not as nice looking as our CSS Grid layout. Any other questions? Wow, all right. Oh, yes.
Yeah, just another question about the IE stuff.
Yeah.
In Can I Use, it says partial support using a prefix.
Yep.
Is that like the only difference? Or, what is the actual difference between the versions?
So, let me go back to that slide. So if you look here, it says that IE11 has this like little dash mark, which means what you said, that you can use vendor prefix CSS Grid. The syntax is a little bit different. At the moment, I can't recall a specific example, but I've looked at it before, and it's a little bit different. But you can actually create grid layouts for IE11 and Edge 15. It's going to require a little bit more work to put in those vendor prefixed properties.
It's like a different syntax rather than like in Flexbox. Sometimes there's just like a little hash workaround you have to do to get it to display properly.
Yeah, but for these it's just a different syntax. Like some of the properties weren't named the same in that first iteration. So that's it. Any other questions? No? All right, well, you can find me around. If you have any questions, I'll be enjoying my Mountain Dew somewhere. And thank you very much.